Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you would like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. On today's episode, Sam Brandsen joins us to discuss bias in AI, starting a play group for autistic children, and supporting those with high support needs. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Sam, thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories.
Of course. Thanks for letting me join.
Absolutely. And I'd love to start off by learning, where does your story in the autistic community begin?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it sort of has two parts in that obviously I've been autistic my whole life. And even before I really knew that autism was a thing that existed, I'd found a sort of unofficial autistic community where growing up I often was more able to connect with other people who had some other type of social difference. And actually, many of us ended up realizing later in life that we're neurodivergent. But kind of going into my 20s, I started, I guess, feeling a lot of the accumulation of sort of social isolation and just perceiving that the world wasn't really that accommodating of people who communicate differently. And that ended up being much more amplified when I started seeing my child experience that. So, for example, I've always had some challenges in healthcare settings. Usually, doctors might not be certain what to make of my style of communication. And that wasn't pleasant, of course. But when you watch your child go through that, it's just really hard because I think every parent wants their child to feel, accepted and to feel treasured for who they are. And I also realized, he has other disabilities as well. And I was realizing how many barriers he was experiencing just in access to school, access to childcare, access to a lot of things that I think make life meaningful and enjoyable for people. And so when I finally found out that there is a neurodiversity movement and sort of an autism rights movement, it was such a relief. Even just finding out that, I guess I'd known this before, but really starting to think about autism research coming from a background in physics research was such a relief because it felt like all of these experiences that we've been having finally had a constructive outlet. There's a way to meet other people and to kind of turn that isolation into a sense of community and to maybe start doing some advocacy about some of the difficult experiences that we'd had or that I'd heard others have. And so, yeah, I started kind of connecting to neurodiversity related groups at Duke and in the community and started trying to put together some neurodiversity related play groups and summer camps and so on.
Now, you mentioned research. You're currently a researcher at the Duke Center for Autism and Brain Development. And earlier this year, you published some really interesting research on if AI is biased against words like autism. What did you find out in your research?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was a really interesting paper, and I was grateful to have some support from a researcher who knows much more about AI than I do and kind of getting started on it. But essentially, just as a little bit of background, and let me know if this is too much rambling, but AI is involved in a lot of different decision making processes. So, an example of this might be scanning resumes or making medical decisions. And unfortunately, AI learns from humans. Well, that can be fortunate, but it can also be unfortunate because it means that it can pick up the biases that we have. So, for example, one sort of instance of this that I noted was in 2014, I guess Amazon had developed this AI algorithm that would scan people's resumes and it would give each applicant a score between 1 and 5 stars. And by 2015, so just the following year, they actually had to essentially fire this AI resume scanner because it was penalizing any resume that included the word women's. It was essentially looking based on human data and realizing that there was sort of gender related bias, and then it was copying that in its own algorithm. And there have been other instances of this as well with, other areas of identity that might be discriminated against. So we were kind of curious, how does this apply to neurodiversity? Does it apply to neurodiversity? If so, what type of biases exist? So we were looking at word embedders, which essentially look at potentially billions of words in human related text, and they see how humans connect words to each other. So if two words are closely connected, the algorithm will kind of store it close together. And you can essentially look to see how clusters of words are grouped to figure out how what the AI algorithm thinks about these concepts. I mean, that's not a very precise way of phrasing it, but essentially we can figure out how these words are related and the way that they're stored. And it can sometimes give us an indication of human bias as well. So we were looking at different words related to neurodivergence like autism, ADHD, OCD, schizophrenia, and we were looking at a variety of different biases. So good versus bad, dangerous versus safe, attractive versus unattractive. We looked at concepts like childish. We were trying to pick biases that had some kind of research backing. For example, we know that some autistic individuals report feeling infantilized or treated younger than they are. So we would test that as a bias. We know that sometimes autistic individuals are perceived as awkward or weird, kind of negative words associated with that. So we put that in as a test. Basically, every test we ran, we found a pretty high level of bias. And we would test these on a variety of different word embeddings. So we weren't just singling out one in particular, but across most of these algorithms, we were finding high levels of bias. And when we moved to kind of sentence encodings, which is basically looking at what we could informally think of as a goodness ratio for how AI encodes sentences, a sentence like I'm autistic actually had more of a negative rating than a sentence like I'm a bank robber, which of course would be somewhat concerning. So that's sort of a brief overview of the research project.
You mentioned human bias. So hopefully AI developers are concerned with taking bias out of their systems. And if they are, what might be some ways that they can remove negative bias from words like autism in AI?
Yeah. So fortunately, I believe that there are some pretty good debiasing algorithms out there once an area of bias has been identified. And unfortunately, the knowledge of like the mechanics of those algorithms is a little bit beyond my scope, but it seems like there is still a need for people to identify these biases in the first place because algorithm developers aren't going to debias something that they don't know exists. And so we have to kind of test it and consult with neurodivergent individuals to see what biases they think might exist and figure them out. There's more. This is not something that was in the research paper. This is more just anecdotal, very informal and non-rigorous. But I think I tried this and also heard from other people using ChatGPT. If they ask it to write a story about an autistic individual, it will often write about an autistic child. It sometimes can be kind of hard to get to write about an autistic adult. So, if that's true, that could be something that could be debiased as well. And I think there is also an emerging area of research of how do you debias kind of compound identities. So we were just looking at terms like autism, ADHD, but what if that's combined with another marginalized identity? As kind of a phrase. Is there a way that AI can debias kind of multidimensional areas of bias?
And Sam, I can't make this up if I tried, but someone just texted me an
Oh,
article about an AI model aids early detection of autism.
Oh, yeah. I think Duke has actually been, I don't know if that specific article is related to Duke, but Duke has been working on that as well. Eye scanning. Is it kind of the eye movement tracking
I
for
don't
autism?
know. It's from
Yeah.
Medical Express, which makes me wonder maybe there's some bias in
Yeah.
there. I know it's some medical information, so I'll have to look at it later and let you know more
Yeah.
about that.
Definitely.
So, from what I understand, with your work at the Duke Autism Center, your primary focus is understanding and promoting quality of life for us as autistic people. How do you hope to do that? What you're doing currently, or what does that look like for you, hopefully in the future?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of current efforts, we have started a neurodiversity task force. So right now it's a pretty small and informal group, but one that I'm really glad we were able to get going. And we basically meet once a month and talk about neurodiversity and things related to quality of life for neurodivergent individuals, whether that's making research more accessible so that neurodivergent individuals can not only be participants, but can actually help guide the process, or discussing with people from the school district what neurodiversity inclusive IEP or school accommodations might look like. So that's kind of hopefully a way for people to learn more about different topics and also make their own perspectives heard and maybe just connect with other people who have an interest in neurodivergence. We also have been working on support for faculty, clinicians, and students. I know that each of those are going to be different groups with distinct needs, but we found that there's some essentially domains of inclusion, whether it's making things more sensory friendly, having clear communication. I think oftentimes where neurodivergent people end up being excluded, even if unintentionally, is if there's these unwritten rules that they're supposed to pick up on. Maybe something is framed as optional, but it's not really optional, or maybe there's a certain social rule that everyone's just expected to know. So we try and, I guess, raise understanding of how direct communication can be really helpful. Predictability and structure definitely can be really helpful, and so on. So we kind of try to share some education about that. But a lot of it is also just learning. I have certainly a lot of my own ideas and perspectives of what I think could be helpful, but I've been really interested in trying to get feedback from students and from people working in different areas about what their needs are, because there's certainly a lot for me to learn as well. Like, we did a student panel recently, and many people highlighted that for them, one of the barriers to getting accommodations was just realizing that they're neurodivergent in the first place, which made me realize that in the future, we probably need some way to help people gain that knowledge or know what resources exist when they enter Duke, because otherwise, someone might go underlooked the whole time and we might not even realize that we're not serving them well. In terms of future hopes, we've started kind of a school outreach program, kind of inspired by one of my autistic colleagues at the center. The idea is that if we go to preschools or work with young children to teach them about sensory processing and autism, hopefully we can foster some understanding of it and maybe also do a bit of bullying prevention as well. Because I think it's just so much easier to sort of prevent that sort of stigma or bullying or trauma from occurring than to try and heal it later and after it's already occurred. So we like that sort of proactive approach. And then I guess the last hope is just to get more research grants to look at things like quality of life for autistic people with higher support needs and living in group homes, how people access medical care, etc. And my hope is that research funders, nationally will shift their funding priorities as well to maybe include some of these topics in the future.
I think that's really interesting about teaching sensory processing to preschoolers. I haven't heard of that education existing at that young of an age. Do you have an idea of what that would look like, or is that more of a stay tuned, Doug?
Yeah, so we've done, I think, a couple presentations so far. They definitely have a lot of energy for exploring sensory processing at that age, even if they're not thinking it in those terms. The At one place we brought sort of a spinning chair to get a sense of, shucks, I'm forgetting the term now, but is it like vestibular input?
Yes.
Basically, when people are rotating. And we brought a variety of other things as well, like visual input, toy music things that they could play. But everyone just wanted to go to the spinning chair. So um, a lot of sensory seeking at that age. I think it was really neat to see how I think children often approach things with a lot of curiosity and directness, which can make it very easy to share information with them at that age. They don't seem to have that hesitancy of maybe asking the wrong thing or embarrassment with their questions. So I think in some ways they can learn faster.
You mentioned it earlier in our conversation about a play group, but you are the founder of All Neurotypes Play Group. And the description of the playgroup states that in this playgroup, no one has to hide autistic traits and children are free to play in their own unique way. I'm curious what you've learned from organizing and creating this playgroup.
Yeah, a lot. I learned a great deal from it. And yeah, I did start on neurotypes. Right now it is a team effort. We have two wonderful collaborators and one wonderful alumni who kind of helped us get started with our first year at camp, and now she's moved on to other neurodiversity related endeavors, which is great too. So the play group itself was a little bit tricky just because we were holding it in the public park, and so we would be there for the playgroup. There would also be people there not for the playgroup, and there's sort of a fluctuating playgroup size. So it was a good experience, but it was one that was a little bit, unfortunately, a little bit tricky to sustain just because of some of my own medical problems. But what we have been able to host more reliably, starting I think 3 years ago, and then we've gradually increased our program over the last 2 years, is a summer camp, which has the aims of the playgroup, but we wanted to make sure that families have some chance for respite care. I think that oftentimes, especially if a family has a child with higher support needs, depending on what those support needs are, it can be really hard for them to find inclusive childcare. Some families might even have previous challenging experiences with other camps where they thought it would be a little bit more accessible, and then it ended up not being as accessible as they hoped. So our goal was to really create a camp that, first of all, would be affordable, where the actual price of our camp is somewhat high, but it's donation based, so no one would ever be turned away from lack of funding. They can pay whatever they feel is affordable, because we really don't want neurodiversity affirming care to only be for people with a certain level of financial means. We also have more adults than, or not adults, we also have some wonderful junior volunteers. We have more volunteers than children because we wanted to make sure that we have enough people that every child can have a one-to-one aide if they want, and maybe a few other adults or junior volunteers floating around setting up activities or helping fill in if someone needs a break. One thing that we've tried to be quite intentional about is making sure that neurodivergent and disabled individuals are represented among our volunteers as well. I think oftentimes neurodivergent children may not have that many chances to sort of see neurodivergent mentors throughout their life. They might interact with other children who are neurodivergent, but in an environment that's led by potentially neurotypical clinicians, or at least clinicians who they don't know are neurodivergent. And so we thought that kind of mentorship could be potentially helpful for children. And we want it to be just a, I guess, pleasant and safe experience for children. So we do a lot of training for volunteers beforehand on, for example, what are ways that autistic children might play differently. Of course, it's going to be unique depending on the child, but there's some play schemas or trajectories that autistic children are more likely to have that might go misunderstood if there isn't that training in place. So we try to really help people get into the child's perspective and understand what the child's motivation for doing certain things might be and how to sort of use a very child-led approach. We do try to set up different activity stations and different events, but in a way that's very flexible. So no one's forced to do anything that they don't want to. If a child wants to spend their whole day on a particular activity, that's completely fine. And the other main part of it, at least for me, is just getting feedback. We send out feedback forms after camp, and I love that because it gives us a sense of the positive impact of the camp, which is really good to see. And it also gives us a lot of ideas for things that we can continue to change or improve going forward. And yeah, it's been a really, really special experience, I guess.
I love hearing about that type of training because there's so much misunderstanding about autistic play, from those that are 2, 3 years old to those that
Yeah.
are adults. And just to be able to give that education is really important. Like, if someone wants to do the thought of as a stereotypical autism play as lining things up, like,
Yeah.
everyone lines things up in the world.
Right.
Go
Yeah.
to a grocery store, go to a parking lot. Everything is lined up, for goodness sake. Um,
Yeah.
so I think, but just people kind of like understanding those things are really helpful.
Yeah. That's one of our slides actually is I should use the grocery store example. That's a great one. We have like this graphic of why someone might enjoy lining things up, and it can be relaxing, it can be soothing. Sometimes when people are doing something repetitive with their hands, it lets their mind sort of be free and more creative. And then our belief is also that even if we really can't understand what a child's enjoying about the way that they're playing, clearly there's something that they're benefiting from it, or they wouldn't
Yeah.
be playing in that way. So at some point, we don't have to understand it, even if the understanding can be.
Let just autistic joy happen.
Exactly. Yeah.
I read you're particularly interested on how the neurodiversity movement can better address the needs and perspectives of neurodivergent individuals who have higher support needs. Where do you think we are in terms of listening to actually listening to the
Yeah.
perspectives of neurodivergent folks who have higher support needs so we can better understand and support them based on their lived experiences?
Unfortunately, I would guess that we still have probably a long, long way to go. And I guess under the umbrella of higher support needs, the way I've tentatively been thinking about it, or areas that I've been trying to learn more about recently, and I realize these aren't mutually exclusive categories and they're probably not fully complete either, but autistic people who also have physical disabilities or who have intellectual disabilities or highly stigmatized mental health conditions such as schizophrenia or psychosis. Also, anyone who uses AAC to communicate. These are just things that I rarely see discussed in the neurodiversity movement. And unfortunately, even a lot of avenues that are sort of becoming available for autistic self advocates, which is wonderful to see, they may not always be accessible. For example, some research initiatives are looking for autistic advisory panels, which I think is a step forward for research. But oftentimes, those panels require one to be able to participate in a sort of typical academic environment, which might not be accessible for someone who needs plain language, for example. Or they might require someone to present sort of a specific time frame, which can be my understanding. I'm not an AAC user, but my understanding is that can be tricky because AAC often requires more time to prepare and to respond spontaneously. And so I would love to see there be more research on this areas, more focus groups, and just when we look at the research priorities of the autistic community, I would love to see that based on, also include maybe priorities that perhaps are more specific to some of these groups. For example, I don't often see AAC mentioned as a priority when just the general autistic population is surveyed. But my understanding is that among AAC users, it's often a very high priority. Other things like guardianship might be a high priority to someone with intellectual disabilities. So I think a long way to go, which is disheartening, but also encouraging because it means that there's a lot that we can do and hopefully can improve. And I also think that, in addition to just being, I think, the right thing to do, it's not at all in conflict with supporting autistic individuals who might typically be described as having lower support needs. Because if we can make an environment that is accessible for autistic individuals with a full variety of support needs, including the highest support needs, then automatically, pretty much it will be built in that those with lower support needs will also probably have their accommodation needs met. So, and I also think that part of this could include maybe expanding our emphasis on neurodiversity affirming approaches to include things that may be more challenging to think about. I think sometimes there's a lot of emphasis on the strengths and positives of being autistic, which is wonderful. Like, I think autistic joy is a beautiful thing, and I think that we need those positives out there in the world. And also at the same time, sometimes autistic people can experience, or neurodivergent individuals can experience aspects of their neurodivergence which are stressful. Like, for example, if you have psychosis, that can be a really, depending on how that experience manifests, it can be a really isolating and difficult experience. And so, kind of thinking about what does the neurodiversity affirming approach mean in that context and how can we sort of center it on the concept of autonomy and respect and learning from someone's experience without necessarily needing that element of positivity to be there. I think that might be a helpful reframing as well. But of course, these are just tentative thoughts and things that I'm constantly learning about myself. So I wish I had more of the answers.
And lastly, Sam, how can our listeners learn about you beyond this interview?
I love hearing from people about their experiences. My email is pretty much always open. We have our website of all neurotypes where we have some information about our summer camp, and we have our YouTube channel. We've been trying to kind of interview people about their experiences with, both personal experience with neurodivergence, professional experience, especially some of those areas that are more under discussed. And it's also sometimes just a place where I share my thoughts about autism and research so that we have a few different types of videos there, but you're welcome to look at them and we always like feedback on anything as well.
Well, Sam, it was wonderful to meet you today. Thanks so much for joining us and sharing your story.
Thank you so much for letting me join. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much to Sam for the conversation. To learn more about Sam, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. We always love hearing from you and would especially love to hear from you relating to this episode on what would have made summer camp more accessible to you growing up. Did you know Autism Personal Coach provides neurodiversity affirming support by autistics for autistics? We empower autistic adults and teens to lead self directed, purpose driven lives through our customized life coaching and community groups. Our distinct approach prioritizes each client's unique goals and preferences, fostering a sense of agency and promoting self advocacy. Coaches work collaboratively with clients to develop personalized strategies and tools that can help with executive functioning, emotional regulation, relationship building, stress management, and much more. We also support parents and partners of autistic individuals by providing insights and guidance to bridge communication gaps and nurture mutual understanding. With our accessible remote services, individuals from any location can receive the assistance and mentoring they need. So please join us today to experience judgment-free coaching rooted in empathy, expertise, and respect for autistic identity. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.